The Highgate Haunting by Daniel Bridge. London, 1890, is when our story starts, and it begins with the ramblings of a homeless man who spent the night sleeping in Highgate Cemetery. He told of how he woke during the night and saw a large figure stalking around the cemetery. However, the report was simply ignored as that of him being in a drunken stupor. 12 months later, another sighting was reported, this time by a middle-aged woman who was walking past the cemetery gates. She described the figure as extremely tall, over 7 feet, and walked with a hunch. She then went on to explain how she shouted over as no one should be in there after dark. The figure turned to face her, and as it did so, let out a haunting scream. This was witnessed by 2 young men on their way home from the local public house, and their recollection was a little more horrifying. They said that the screaming figure had very sharp, pointed teeth, sunken, glowing red eyes, and was dressed in a floor-length black overcoat, top hat, and carried a very expensive-looking cane. The next morning, as she passed the cemetery again, she decided to visit the grave of her departed father. As she walked down the pathway to the exit, she saw the horrific sight. Colour drained from her face as she stared at what lay before her. Wrapped in layers of worn and dirty clothes, the body was of a local homeless man known as Bruno. His body was grey and his eyes pure white, like the irises had been drained of colour. What or who did this? Over the next few months, several other sightings of the figure were reported. All of them described a hunched, grey figure that appeared almost ghost-like, transparent in fact. In time, the apparition became known as the Highgate Spectre, and was one of only a handful of unusual happenings there. Firstly was the story of the gent who was walking home after a long shift at work, and he described seeing a ghost-like woman gliding around the outskirts of the cemetery, but as quick as she appeared, she was gone. It was at this point that a fear began to set in amongst the local residents, and if they could avoid the cemetery at all, then they would. This was not always the case, as we are about to find out. Some time later, a young courting couple bore witness to an elderly couple walking hand in hand around the cemetery grounds, dressed in clothing such as may be seen over 100 years previously, and as they glanced again, the couple was gone. Soon people who claimed to be able to banish these spirits from the catacombs of the cemetery arrived and tried to claim payment for their services, calling themselves spirit investigators, and soon the area around the cemetery was like a freak show had arrived in town, parading around the streets with their dark and sinister look. Tall hat, long coat, black suit and extravagant cane, they then strutted their way into the cemetery to try and get a first-hand look at the spirits in question. As they patiently waited, the mist began to settle over the lush greenery, partially covering the gravestones, giving them even more of a macabre, eerie appearance. Just then, from the western catacombs, the figure appeared. From a distance, he looked like a very normal elderly gent, but then the visitors received the full force of the spirit's anger. The rival investigators decided to focus all their attention on the western catacombs, and several apparitions showed themselves over the next few hours. From the elderly lovebirds to the tragedy of plague victims, the investigators turned it into a battle between themselves to see who could banish the spirits back to whence they came first. Things didn't quite go to plan, however, as several of their entourage perished at the hands of these evil spectres, or at least that's how they were portrayed by the outsiders. It was deemed necessary to invade the tombs within the winding alleys of the western catacombs and open coffins, as they believed that the conditions of the bodies would determine who the spirits were, and maybe what they wanted. Overall, 12 people perished that fateful evening. They all appeared to have been drained of life. Their skin became grey and wrinkled, and their eyes were sunken deep inside their sockets. It was a belief that they were not, in fact, victims of the spirits, but of vampires. But this theory was quickly dispelled due to lack of evidence. The freak show continued for several days. Several graves were violated, and for no apparent gain, as the spirits still appeared, probably now more than ever before, and the people decided that was enough and told them to leave. They had desecrated the graves of their loved ones, and the people were no better off. The rivalry between the investigators continued for many years. However, we know that neither of them was successful in what they claim, don't we?